Hello, everyone. Good morning. You know me. I'm Mohsen. I'm associate professor here at the OI, and also research affiliate at MIT. So before we get started, just a few items about the logistics. For your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. If you are joining us online, please put your questions into Q&A box, and those in the room, save your questions until the end of each talk, and we will answer them after the talks. If you wish to ask questions with your microphone or camera on, please raise your hand during the Q&A, and we will call on you. Be aware this will be recorded will be included in the recording. So, I'm super happy to have two of my great collaborators in this workshop. So Jenny Allen is incoming professor at NYU Stern. She's currently a postdoc at Penn, working in computational social science. She graduated from MIT. That's how I know her. And her research interests include misinformation, political persuasion, and wisdom of crowds. You may know her from her recent paper in Science in this area as well. And then Reid Orchinik is a PhD candidate in management science at MIT Sloan. His research focuses on how information environments shape cognition, including the way we process information like news, persuasive messages, and marketing communications. We will start with Jenny. She will give her talk, like 45 minutes, including Q&A, and then there will be Reid, similar setup. And then at 12 p.m. we will have lunch, and then we socialize and just get to know each other better and can ask more questions from the speakers. Without further ado, Jenny, please take it away. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Mohsen, for inviting me, and thank you to the OII for hosting. I'm giving a talk on some pretty new work called No Need to Lie, Falsehoods Offer No Persuasive Advantage Over Biased Facts. I would love any feedback, any questions that you guys have. Please feel free to raise your hands if you have any clarifying questions during the talk, and then hopefully we'll have more time to have more in-depth questions at the end. Okay, and with that, we'll start. So misinformation and fake news is a problem that I think most of us in this room are aware of, are familiar with. Since the 2016 election and Brexit, fake news and online falsehoods spreading on the internet have been a source of major public concern and vibrant academic debate. And this concern has continued to today, where misinformation and disinformation have been rated the #1 global risk in 2025 by the World Economic Forum. But despite all of this attention, fake news is actually, and misinformation of the kind of objectively egregiously false variety makes up only a very small % of what people are seeing on a day-to-day basis. And so this is a figure from our 2020 Science Advances paper that finds that fake news makes up less than 0.1% of our overall information consumption. So even though stories like this kind of canonical example of fake news, Pope endorses Donald Trump, shocks the world, got a lot of attention and kind of hold a lot of space in our media and kind of the cultural understanding. This makes up a very small % of what people are actually seeing online on a day-to-day basis. However, even though falsehoods, make up a very small % of what people are seeing on the internet on a day-to-day basis, they could be still exceptionally powerful if they have a particular persuasive advantage. And so, Hannah Arendt in 1967 wrote, since the liar is free to fashion his facts, the chances are that he will be more persuasive than the truth teller. So lies and falsehoods spreading online might not always have an advantage of prevalence. They might not be widespread, but when people see them, they might be particularly persuasive because liars are able to kind of craft the aren't constrained by reality and are able to craft the most convincing possible argument to the audience to be compelling and persuasive. And there has been evidence that misinformation can affect, important societal outcomes, things like vaccine hesitancy and climate skepticism. There's evidence that misinformation and falsehoods do kind of affect these outcomes in a negative way, which we find concerning. However, there hasn't actually been a ton of work on the persuasive effect of misinformation. And much of the work that has been done doesn't really disentangle the frame of misinformation. So, the argument it's making, whether it's showing, a topic in a particularly positive or negative light, for example, from its factual accuracy. And so what exactly do I mean by this? So I'm just going to give an example from a paper that came out in 2021 on vaccine misinformation in Nature Human Behavior. Super highly cited, has thousands of cites. It's a great paper, and it compares the impact of misinformation, vaccine misinformation, with true vaccine information, and finds that misinformation decreases people's willingness to vaccinate pretty substantially. However, if we go and we look at the stimuli that were used in this paper, we'll find that yes, misinformation did decrease, willingness to get a vaccine, but these are all of the examples of the misinformation that were used. And so they're all very negative. And so this is, I don't know if you can quite read this, but for example, this particular tweet says, big pharma whistleblower, 97% of corona vaccine recipients will become infertile. And so not only is this false, it is also, all of the stimuli used in this particular study had a particularly negative valence when it comes to the vaccine. And the opposite was true for the positive stories. And so, there's this, for example, tweet by the University of Oxford, right here, shout out, that says the COVID vaccine produces a good immune response, reveals new study. And so, here when we look at these, this particular example, it's unclear, what's doing the heavy lifting here. Is it the fact that these stories, are false, or is it the valence of the stories? We're not able to tease apart these two dimensions of content. And so, to partially address this issue, in our science paper that came out in last year in 2024, we looked at quantifying the impact of misinformation and vaccine skeptical content on Facebook. And what we did here was, instead of just selecting positive and negative misinformation and true stimuli explicitly, we sampled a large set of 130 different vaccine headlines. Some were true, some were false. We tested all of it, got persuasive effects for all of it, and then determined post hoc which features were most particular at persuading people to not get a vaccine. And so what I'm going to show here is the results of this study. So in the x-axis here, I have this dimension, which is how, to what degree each of the items suggested the vaccines were harmful to a person's health. This is the frame. And on the y-axis, I'm going to show the actual observed treatment effect from these stimuli. And this is what we find. And so the blue dots here are misinformation, and the black dots are true information. And we find is there is a strong negative relationship between the degree to which these headlines suggested the vaccines were harmful to a person's health and the negative treatment effect. But what we find is that while this story here, this false story with the headline "DoD and Fauci caught in massive scandal hiding death and damage from COVID vaccine" was false and lowered people's willingness to get a vaccine, so did this one here by the BBC, Lisa Shaw, presenter's death due to complications with the COVID vaccine. This is a true story, but nonetheless suggested and implied the vaccine was harmful to a person's health, and also we saw had a negative effect on people's willingness to get a vaccine. On the other hand, this story here about a bill filed in Washington to authorize a strike force to involuntarily detain unvaccinated families had essentially a null effect on people's willingness to get a vaccine, and had kind of didn't say anything particular about the safety or health of the vaccine itself. And so what we find here is that the implication of harm, irrespective of veracity, is what predicts the treatment effects. And so it's really the deciding factor here is not necessarily whether or not the item is true or false. It's whether it's presenting the vaccine as harmful to a person's health. But this is just one example in vaccination. And we also are not kind of perfectly controlling things. Yes, we're comparing true and false content, but these stimuli also vary across a variety of different dimensions, the source, the style, etc. And so in this particular study, I'm going to go a little bit deeper, and I'm going to try to disentangle in a more controlled way the effect of framing from the effect of factuality. And the questions that I'm going to answer are, does the frame of a story, positive or negative, have a substantial persuasive effect on the reader while holding factual accuracy constant? So what is the effect of portraying a given story in a very positive or very negative light while again, holding the factual accuracy constant? And in a complementary way, I'm also going to look at, does false information have a greater persuasive impact than true information holding the frame constant? Is Hannah Arendt right? Do liars have a particular advantage when it comes to persuasion? Again, holding this frame constant, unlike past studies, we're going to actually try to tease apart and get the actual, particular effect of factuality, controlling for these other features. So how exactly am I going to do this? So, again, past research has on misinformation has compared the persuasive effect of true versus false content, but these stimuli often varied in a variety of other dimensions beyond just the falsity, source, valence, style, etc. And so how can we compare these things in a very apples to apples way? Well, we weren't able to before, but now we have these, amazing tools called LLMs, and we're able to build a pipeline to systematically generate synthetic articles based on a selection of quotes and facts from real articles in a very controlled way, where we're varying the veracity of evidence, holding fixed other features like the frame and the tone and the length of the articles. And what we do, the kind of source of the articles that we use to do this is what we call the media bias detector. And so this is a project from this computational social science lab at Penn, where they scrape the top 20 articles from 10 mainstream publishers' homepages 5 times a day, and cluster these articles into different cohesive events using vector embeddings. And then use GPT to label these different embeddings and annotate the various features of these event clusters, including things like the topic, the political leaning, tone, the sentence type, so whether or not each sentence in the article is a fact, a quote, or an opinion, and then the tone of each sentence. And so, we're able to have this really great data set of these, popular news articles that are kind of labeled in this very, very granular manner, thanks to GPT. And I recommend if people are interested to check out the tool. It's really cool. And you can see kind of the different coverage and the valence of the different coverage and the lean of the different coverage of from all of these different top news sources. And so once we have these event clusters, what we do is we select several particular events that received attention in the news media, and collect the 2 most positive and 2 most negative stories about the event. And so we have 4 stories in particular. We extract these important sentences, these facts and quotes from these articles. And so we have this list of 20 to 40 facts and quotes extracted from the articles. And then we use GPT, particularly GPT-4o, to write positive and negative versions of these events, varying the factuality of the articles. And so we're, drawing from the same events and changing the different facts that are used to vary the positivity and negativity, the valence, as well as the factuality. And then we test the impact of these synthetic articles in a randomized survey experiment to see how it affects people's feelings and opinions about these news topics. And so the research design is as follows. So it's a 3x2 research design. First, we're going to vary the frame of the articles. And so articles are going to be either highly positive, where we instruct the LLM to portray the event or main subject in as positive as possible of a light or as negative as possible of a light, and tell it to draw on only the positive facts or only the negative facts. And then the other dimension that we vary is the veracity of the content. To the accurate condition, we again instruct the LLM to only use the actual facts extracted from these news articles. In the false exaggerated condition, so we have two different falsehoods conditions, kind of speaking to two kind of different types of misinformation. In the exaggerated condition, this is kind of like a kernel of truth style stimulus, where there is the similar kind of the article itself is very similar, but we instruct the LLM to manipulate the existing facts to be as extreme as possible. And I'll give you an example that I think will make this more clear. And in the fabricated condition, we don't give the LLM any facts at all, and we say, okay, totally fabricate all facts about this. Make up people, make up quotes, and just generate a fake news article totally from scratch. And so these are the kind of 6 conditions that we are going to look at. Yes.
Is your instruction to the LLM say even about persuasiveness?
We say it doesn't say like specifically be as persuasive as possible, but we say portray this as in as positive of a light as possible, or portray this in as negative as a light as possible. You are a journalist writing this article. This is your goal, is to be as kind of slanted or biased as possible, but not particularly on this kind of like yes persuasive. So this is just an example of one of the topics that we looked at. This is a news story that happened near the end of Biden's term, where Biden granted clemency to 1,500 individuals in the largest single-day clemency act in modern history. Some recipients were nice, like this guy Arthur Lawrence Byrd, who didn't have any past nonviolent convictions, and then some people were bad, like these kind of corrupt public figures, Michael Conahan and Rita Crendwell. This is the actual event. And this is just kind of an example of the articles that were generated by GPT in the different versions. So in the accurate positive article, it really highlights, okay, so it says Joe Biden granted pardons to 1,500 people, and highlights kind of Arthur Lawrence Byrd, says that he's has great work ethic, great safety record, etc. In the exaggerated condition, it kind of increases some of these numbers. So from 1,500 to 2,000 people, it kind of adds kind of color details. They're saying he's not only like a general nice guy, but he's a community leader. He founded a nonprofit. In the fabricated condition, it totally kind of like dispenses with Arthur Byrd at all, and says, there's a public opinion poll that said that 73% of Americans support this initiative. Recidivism studies that show that this will cause a 40% reduction in crime, which is obviously absolutely implausible and ridiculous. No one noticed. But these are kind of pretty egregious falsehoods, I think, especially in the fabricated condition. And then kind of parallel things happening in the negative stories. And so in the accurate story, instead of highlighting this nice guy who got clemency, highlights these, famous embezzlers who were indicted in this Kids for Cash scandal. In the exaggerated condition, again, it says it kind of increases the number of people who are affected, increases like the damages by the court. And in the fabricated condition, it again, makes up these quotes by these fake organizations. It's kind of funny. The president appears more invested in scoring political points than keeping community safe. This is a spokesperson for the National Victims Alliance. And so we have these 6 different versions, kind of varying both, similar topic, holding fixed a lot of these details constant, but just varying the factuality and kind of the extremity of the falsehoods. So that was just one example, but we also picked 6 different topics. And then we tried to get these, spanning a variety of different events. And so we had, Biden's clemency act. We also had some kind of right-leaning politics, Pete Hegseth's Senate confirmation. We had international politics, Israel-Hamas ceasefire, some technology stuff, DeepSeek, kind of a more cultural event, the Norwegian royal wedding, and then an international politics of Bangladesh's transitional leadership. So the goal here was trying to get a wide variety of different topics and different events. And the experiment that we ran was as followed. So we sampled 500 respondents, all prolific, and each respondent read 3 different articles. And each article was randomly assigned to one of the 6 different conditions. So this is a mixed subjects design. It doesn't really matter so much that they each read 3 articles if you just filter, or if you just subset to the first article they read. the results look very similar, but this just helps us increase our statistical power. We gather their demographics and the pre-treatment information about how much they know about these 6 events, as well as their political knowledge. And then participants were shown one of the articles and answered 5 questions, 5 different questions. And this is our main outcome variable here, which is, how do you rate your feelings towards the main subject of the article? So this is kind of an affect. It's a typical feeling thermometer that is often used to measure things like polarization. And this is a very common outcome used in kind of persuasion. We also measured some other things like the tone, informativeness, credibility, how likely are you to share this article on social media, and 3 topic-specific questions that were more about people's opinions about the policies, and so do you support Biden's clemency acts, etc. And then, of course, participants were debriefed and shown corrections if they saw false information. Okay, and so what do we find? So this is just our main results. And so on the y-axis here, on the right, or I guess the left, we're showing just kind of the raw means of this average feelings towards the main subject of the story on a 1 to 6 scale. And we're going to show that for the positive and negative conditions and the 3 veracity conditions respectively. And then on this side, I'll show the treatment effects. And so I'll show the accurate condition first. This is what we find. Huge effect of the frame or the tone of the article on people's opinions about or feelings towards the main subject. And so this is, a 2 scale point or effect essentially, or 1.8, which is about a 1.1, 1.2 Cohen's d. And so this is a very substantial effect. We find a big effect of framing on people's opinions. I was actually surprised at how big this effect was. Coming from other persuasion research where we find much smaller effect. And okay, so that's the accurate condition. So we can actually manipulate people's opinions and feelings towards subjects without lying at all. But what happens if we do lie? Is there any kind of particular advantage of lying? Can we get even bigger effects here? And so if we do expect effects, we would expect the positive condition to be more positive and the negative condition to be more negative. We would expect the treatment effect to increase. But we don't find that to be the case. In fact, we find kind of remarkably similar treatment effects across these 3 conditions. And so we actually don't find evidence of what we call a liar's advantage. What really seems to matter in terms of affecting people's downstream outcomes is the frame. And whatever details, whatever kind of the factuality of the details, the arguments, they seem to be kind of a very, marginal effect, or no particular effect, controlling for the balance. And, perhaps unsurprisingly, this effect is different for different topics. And so for topics where maybe people, they're more polarized or people have strong opinions like this Pete Hegseth topic, we find smaller effects, which I think is to be expected. And for the topics where people had less information, it's kind of Norwegian wedding, Muhammad Yunus, who is the transitional leader of Bangladesh, where people were coming in with no information, we find huge effects. I think this is, we did pick, topics that were not, we didn't, pick the US presidential election where you would expect there to be, super strong and perhaps immovable, treatment effects. So I think that, this is important to look at, but we should also consider the effects of generalizability. We did not, test the most kind of well-known topics, and that was, so we could actually vary this and find see if we can find effects at all, and for power reasons, but just important to know. Oh, and then also I should say, there are some topics in which, the false story does seem to be better. So whatever, in this Muhammad Yunus story, it does seem like the false exaggerated condition is kind of the more compelling one. But there's not like a consistent pattern across the different topics. It's not like always lies have an advantage. They might have an advantage in some cases, but it's not consistent. Oh, and this is just kind of what I was alluding to earlier about the moderation of informativeness. People have different levels of informativeness across these different topics. They don't know anything about Norwegian weddings. They know more about the Israel-Hamas ceasefire and Biden clemency acts, kind of the more local or kind of things that have been in the news more. And again, so we see this moderation by people's pre-treatment informativeness. When people had kind of low information have bigger effects, high information have smaller effects. We see this kind of narrowing in here. And as the informativeness goes up, the treatment effect goes down. Again, this is very in line with Bayesian theories of persuasion. People have a lot of knowledge. They update less. What I will say, and I don't have a slide for this, but I'll just say it, is that we also looked at whether informativeness protected against the false conditions. And so were people who are more informed about these subjects less do they have a smaller effect in the false conditions? Were they able to kind of be pre-bunked in some way? Were their prior knowledge protected them against these kinds of false conditions? And we essentially find no, there is no moderating effect of informativeness on these veracity conditions. People didn't seem to update less, even if they knew more about the topic in the false conditions. Okay, what about perceived credibility? Were people able to tell that these stories were false? The false stories were false. I'm going to show a very similar plot to earlier, but instead of looking, at the effect of framing within each condition, I'm just going to show the effect of credibility on positive compared to negative stories, and then false stories compared to accurate stories in our two kind of veracity conditions. And this is what we find. Which is that there isn't a ton of variation in people's perceptions of credibility across our 6 different conditions. And so what we actually find is that there is a significantly small effect of positive tone on credibility. And so things that were portrayed in a more positive light were actually seen as more credible. This is actually, I found, quite surprising, and I think goes against people's perceptions and perhaps the news media's perceptions of needing to perhaps take a particularly negative stance on a topic to seem more credible, to seem more, to seem critical and unbiased. What these results suggest is that, that maybe need not be the case, and actually being overly negative can reduce people's belief in your credibility. However, on the veracity conditions, we see kind of no effect of the veracity conditions. People are not able to determine that these false conditions were false. They're kind of not able to pick up on these, kind of, I think, pretty egregious lies in a lot of cases that, this random clemency act of 1,500 people is going to reduce recidivism by 40%. That's crazy, but people are not picking up on these. And yeah, totally, like, all the details are invented. There's like the senator, like, they're like, senator, totally made up name, not one person. Actually, I think one person in our entire study had a message to us in the feedback and was like, I don't think this is a real person. And that was like one person in our entire study, which is crazy. Okay, so you might think that, okay, well, we just looked at feelings. What about other kinds of opinions? And so we look at all of these different other opinion topics, and I'm not going to go through each of them in detail, although we do kind of break them out in the paper. But we averaged the additional topic-specific questions into an opinion index, which again similarly goes to from 1 negative to 6 positive, and reverse coded kind of the negative outcomes. And just some example questions are: how optimistic are you about Bangladesh's future? How confident are you in Pete Hegseth's ability to lead? Et cetera, et cetera. Do you approve of Israel's decision to have a ceasefire? And so this is what we find, which is, again, very similar effects to the feeling question. The overall effect is smaller. I think maybe because of the way we constructed it, we, again, like, we didn't particularly say persuade people on this particular topic. We said portray this person in a positive or negative light. So I think it might be because of the way we were doing prompting, but we still do see big effects. And again, similar effects across conditions. And these are, this one looks maybe slightly bigger, but it's, we don't actually see any significant differences. And kind of the marginal effect of lying is much smaller than the overall effect of framing. And so you might be familiar with this phrase by Ben Shapiro, which is, facts don't care about your feelings. And I think, based on this presentation, I would edit this slightly and say, it's not facts don't care about your feelings. Your feelings don't care about which facts you're exposed to. You're not able to tell whether the facts are true or false. They are just kind of dependent on the frame based on our findings here. And just to sum up, and how am I doing? Okay. We find that selective presentation of information significantly and substantially alters people's feelings and opinions about a subject. But we find little evidence of what we call this liar's advantage. The effect of falsehoods doesn't amplify the effect of framing. We don't find that you need to lie in order to have an effect. And in fact, lying doesn't really pay additional dividends beyond that of framing. However, lies are not harmless. And I want to emphasize this. It's not like I think that, misinformation, this egregiously false stuff doesn't matter. We do find that, people cannot easily detect these falsehoods. They're very easily generated by LLMs. It took very little prompting to get the LLM to kind of make up crazy facts. So even if they are not more persuasive, they are still, persuasive. And so again, don't come away from this thinking that I said, that lies don't matter. It's don't worry about them. It's not what I'm saying. Lies can be harmful, but also we shouldn't think that sticking to the facts, quote unquote, is gonna fix fix everything and have people converge on the one uniform truth. Sticking to the facts allows for substantial leeway for manipulating or changing public opinion, and this suggests that we should more closely examine selective framing, misleading content in addition to false content, and persistent negativity bias in the media by politicians, by public figures, in addition to just kind of the outright lies. And I think there's been a lot of research on, by, for example, Kate Starboard on, participatory disinformation, where it's all of these things are working together to create both misleading content with negative frames. These outright lies are mixed in to create these overall misleading narratives that can take hold. And I think that we should kind of look at this thing holistically, look at the frame, and not always focus too much. I mean, we do care about factuality, but not ascribe to the belief that just telling people the facts is suddenly going to fix everything. And with that, I will open it up for questions. And thank you to my collaborators, Samar, Amir, Duncan, and David, who worked with me on this problem. So thank you very much.
In the first question that I had, it's like more kind of clarification question. I was wondering if you did any pre-testing to make sure the LLMs, just does not make things up and you're particular,
Yes, so you mean in the accurate conditions? Yeah. So we went through and two RAs, and me, went through and made sure that they weren't changing the facts from the actual articles. And we are assuming that the stuff in the articles is, we're using accurate for facts and quotes that appeared in kind of these mainstream media articles. We don't actually go fact check it beyond showing that it came from the Guardian or whatever. But we do verify that it doesn't change kind of the details of the facts. And it occasionally does. And so we have to go in and kind of edit and correct it, where it'll, paraphrase something that should be a direct quote or something, or vice versa. But yeah, we did do that.
Question number 2 is, you talk about this measure of feeling, and I was wondering how that translates to other things like sharing, for example.
Mm-hmm.
To what extent, covariates that you're changing here affect sharing, because it would be super interesting, because if it's some form translate, in some sense you didn't replicate the results of falsehood,
Right, yeah.
travels deeper, faster, whatever, at the individual level, and you're keeping everything else constant.
Yeah, so I mean, we look at sharing outcomes. We don't find any kind of effects across conditions, from what I remember. Yeah, so we have sharing as one of the outcomes, and there is, so I don't think we find kind of the same effect of, as you know, falsehoods spread farther, faster than the truth. And again, like this is like holding those things constant. And I mean, in that paper, it said it was kind of this is the 2018 science paper, Masugi. Their mechanism is novelty, where they think that things that are more novel, are more shareable. And in some sense, I guess we don't actually control for novelty here. Like the fabricated facts that we are showing people are incredibly novel. No one has ever seen them before. Like, and it doesn't seem like that novelty is driving kind of an increased sharing. So I guess, yeah, I mean, but it's also different. It's, these are full articles versus tweets, and maybe there's other kind of, in that particular study, there might be other variables, going on as well. Like,
I guess one question I had is simply to what extent do you think selective framing deserves the label of accurate in the 3x2 study? In some ways, we're not testing misinformation versus balanced information. You're testing sort of misinfo versus what Wordle has called malinfo, right? Like truthful but misleading. So I was curious if you considered testing a balanced frame, like most mainstream media would have more a balance.
Yeah, so we have a different study that is that Amir was leading, that was just looking at, so here we're just looking at positive versus negative, and in that study it doesn't have the kind of lying conditions. It has positive, neutral, negative, and so in the neutral frame it kind of equally balances positive and negative facts and quotes. I will say that that's not necessarily always, that might be kind of false bias or things like that, but we do that. And what they find is that, kind of neutral is in the middle of positive and negative, but negative actually has a much more negative effect than positive. And so there we see like kind of like a asymmetry where negative stuff has, moves people away from neutral more than positive stuff. So that's what we find. But yeah, I mean, I to be clear, I'm not saying that like the journalism that we are, the kind of articles that we are generating here are an example of good journalism or anything like that. We are kind of like manipulating and kind of turning the dial up on these different levers in order to control and have kind of like a more tightly controlled.
Amazing. And a quick follow-up if I can, which is just to what extent do you think the prolific subject pool may sort of be suspicious of all content coming through? I mean, they might, on the one hand, we could say there's no liar's dividend because the stuff made up didn't have impact, but maybe they just distrust the accurate stuff as well. They just distrust everything. Yeah,
I mean, they do find the stuff. We measured the perceived credibility, and I guess it's like, they find it slightly credible, I guess. So like 3 is the, midpoint.
They kind of find them all. Okay.
So so I mean, like, it's not like they think it's great, but it's not like they think they're like totally totally useless. But yeah, I mean, I think that again, we could rerun this on other kind of more credulous pools. Yes.
I was just wondering, because previous research I had to generate a lot of news through like different LLMs, and what I've sort of found is, and that goes to the sort of the point of framing you made, that when you are generating this sort of false, exaggerated or fabricated news, sort of fake news format, fake news are usually written in very different writing style than normal news. And GPT or GPT-4 usually tends to have the sort of similar writing style, whatever you give it. So like the facts there have changed, maybe sort of, it became sort of more exaggerated and all that stuff, but the basic writing style remains sort of similar. So have you maybe controls for that, or like, do you have any concerns that might have affected the sort of or caused that the results are so close together?
So you mean, I mean, we tried here to control for tone, right? So GPT is like writing all of these with the same tone. The kind of like preamble to the prompts are the same. We also test them and show that they're balanced, and people perceive the tone to be kind of equally extreme. But is your question that
It's
like,
yeah, it's more that like in the real world,
Oh,
they
yeah.
would not have the same sort of writing style. Like
right, yeah, for sure.
Misinformation
I totally,
are written very differently.
Yeah.
Normally.
no, I totally agree with you. And I think that here we are not like saying, you know, does misinformation in the real world have, I totally agree with you that they would have a very different writing style than you know, your typical piece of accurate content. But there are the differences because of the writing style.
Yeah.
And so if we're interested in the writing style, we could vary the writing style. I think that would be very interesting. You can have a sensational story where it's very kind of written in this kind of like, oh my God, like you won't believe what like will happen. Where like the actual event is true. And I think it would be interesting to compare these two things, but you know, ultimately, like that's not about the factuality. And so what we're really interested in here is factuality.
Sorry, I think you were first. So first, what was the demographic? What did it look like? And were there any parts of the demographic that responded differently, or it's just kind of pretty yeah, no major difference?
The demographics we looked, I mean, it was pretty balanced on gender. It's like slightly more educated because it's prolific, more Democratic because it's prolific than Republican. And I don't recall off the top of my head of anything in particular where we found bigger or smaller effects. I would actually expect, and we should look at this is a good idea, like especially for like the political content, the US political content that's like highly kind of Democrat or highly like Republican leaning kind of in general, like the pretext of confirmation, I would say is like kind of a Republican focused topic. I would expect there to be maybe party differences that kind of align with the like how informed people are potentially. But we didn't look at that, and that's something that we should definitely look at. Do you have any ideas what you think would be?
No, I'm just curious about what it was and whether you
yeah.
expect it to be different, to results to be different if you tested this on a very different group anywhere in the world, or
Yeah. I mean, I think that, I mean, I wouldn't ever say that everything is perfectly generalizable. But I definitely think that how much people know about the topic is clearly something that is moderating the effect. If you are super knowledgeable, if you're a person who's super knowledgeable, although political knowledge, we looked at people's political knowledge, and we didn't find that moderated the effects. So people who are kind of more politically knowledgeable in general actually had very similar effects to people who are less politically knowledgeable, which I was surprised by. But actually knowing more about the topic and kind of just being more informed, you have stronger priors and you're moving less. But yeah, in terms of demographics, I should look more into that.
But so I think just quickly, one other thing is, I was curious, how would it have looked if you hadn't used an LLM for this? Just like practically and in terms of like how it would have, I mean, how it might have impacted. Because I guess like it would have been harder, it would have taken longer. But what do you think it might have felt like and looked like?
Right. So, I mean, I think if we had looked at like compared, you know, a mainstream article to a fake news article, it's exactly the point you were making, which is that, you know, they vary on all these other different dimensions. And so we wouldn't be able to know like whether or not the differences we're seeing are because of this sensational language or because of this, you know, maybe it has like a particular kind of visual effect, or maybe people trust the source differently or things like that. There's all these different potentially confounding elements. And so that's why we try to use the LLM, is to control for these confounding elements. And so, I mean, we could have done that ourselves.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
I think like the issue is that, you know, there's not, you know, I think it would be harder for me to like write a fair article or a one-sided article about, you know, if I have a particular political leaning, it's hard to kind of like overcome my own specific bias. And maybe the idea is that the LLMs have more consistent bias across the different topics. Not that it's unbiased, but it's kind of more consistent.
There are also a few questions on.
Oh, okay. And also I'll be around after this. How did you ensure the quality? Yeah, so we went through all of them and then we did edit them by hand. Yes, and we had you know, the 6 conditions, 6 stimuli, so we had 36. Oh, and it's not published. But if you're interested, you can follow up with me and I'll email you a draft. It's not, we haven't posted it yet, but we should be doing that soon. Yes.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about like the kind of like how you exaggerate or fabricate things? Like, is there like a control for like a magnitude, or is there like specific thing that you like numbers, like in terms of like how many people Biden like pardons or
Yeah.
like how many budget it costs, like is there a consistent thing like?
Yeah, no, I mean, we just said kind of as negative as possible, but we said, don't sometimes it would like say things that were the only instruction we gave it was like, don't make it obvious that this is false. And so sometimes like we found in our original generations that sometimes it would say like made up senator, like X person or something, fabricated senator. And we're like, okay, don't do that. And so like maybe there was kind of like that in terms of the limitation, but we didn't, instruct it to say, change all numbers by like 1,000% or like whatever. Maybe that would be, you could control that, and actually that would be, I think, a very interesting study of like, okay, like at what magnitude do people like detect that this is false. I would actually expect that people have a hard time detecting that it is false, even at like crazy implausible numbers, because some of these numbers I think were crazy and implausible that we're telling people, and people didn't seem to determine, but we didn't kind of explicitly instruct. Yeah.
I guess that would be the last question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. So I just had a question about like the actual facts that the LLM fabricated. I know you're trying to keep like the persuasion and kind of like the extremity of the facts like pretty consistent across all 6 of the praxis, but with like misinformation in the real world, like with the code example, like it kind of has an agenda, like it's trying to kind of be more persuasive and like convince somebody that like this is like a really negative event, or like like maybe like fear mongering in a way. So how do you feel like this could have maybe impacted like your study?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like it's definitely true that in real life misinformation does kind of the distribution of misinformation looks different than distribution. But also what we found is like looking at, I was actually just looking at like YouTube the other day, have these like authoritative health sources, and I was like searching the COVID vaccine. It was for kind of a different project, and you find these cases of like authoritative figures who are using this very sensationalized language and are saying, oh my God, like you won't believe what would happen in the with the COVID vaccine. And this is like an authoritative health source. It's not false. It's sensationalized, and it clearly has an agenda, and it's getting around this kind of issue of not containing egregious falsehoods. And I think that like that happens a lot. And I'm not trying to say something general about, all accurate information and all is kind of equivalent to like, misinformation. But I am saying that like if you only focus on misinformation, you're gonna miss kind of the bad stuff that is technically accurate but can be very harmful. Okay, but I should stop, and happy to answer any questions at lunch, and thank you so much.
Great. All right, everyone. I'm Orchinik. I'm a PhD student at MIT Sloan, and I'm going to be talking about a project or a set of projects that link beliefs and adaptive rationality. I'm going to be trying to look at how the structure of information environments shape the cognitive processes that people use to understand things like news. And I think that there is this pretty prevalent view in academic tech and policy spaces that the internet and social and digital media presents this totally overwhelming environment that we can't possibly cognitively manage. And this can be summed up pretty succinctly by Tristan Harris, who is a tech ethicist, who says the fundamental problem of humanity is that we have godlike technology with ancient Paleolithic brains. Your brain is fixed. It's like running Windows 95 and never getting an upgrade. And we think that this occurs even more in the context of politics, where political cognition is incredibly brittle. It plays host to a whole number of biases that makes updating on information difficult, especially when that runs counter to your own political views. And simultaneously, we often think of information environments as being exploitative of that brittle political cognition. So just an example, information overload helps fake news spread, and social media knows it. Or tech platforms and the way that they structure these spaces fuel US political polarization. Put succinctly, Perot and Mandelbaum say advertisers, politicians, social media, and news feeds prey on our evolutionarily ancient methods of forming and changing beliefs. I'm going to argue something a little bit different here, which is that cognition is not brittle in the way that we generally think about it. It dynamically responds to the structure of information environments in pretty fascinating and almost optimal ways. And so what I'm going to try to do is drawing on work by, going all the way back to Herb Simon on bounded rationality. I'm going to try to pair insights on the cognitive representations and the cognitive processes that people use when they navigate information environments and try to understand how these two things interact with each other to produce surprisingly rational behavior, but also predictable harms like polarization or resistance to kind of pro-social behavior. And in general, I kind of think of this process as being broken down into two things. First, people are able to have these simple mental representations that they use to understand complex and ambiguous information. So we have these internal models that are much simpler than external models that let us do prediction and inference quite well. But obviously, because they are simplified, we miss things. And secondly, I try to understand how cognitive processes themselves adapt to information landscapes, generally picking up on statistical structures in the environment, allowing for us to simplify these inference problems and make them computationally tracked. And this is what I'm going to focus on in the talk today. I'm going to try to understand how cognitive processes adapt to these information environments by revisiting classic biases in judgment and arguing that they are both ecologically rational and also that through intuitions, they adapt to help people navigate complex information environments. And to do this, I'm going to first revisit the truth bias, which was kind of made prominent by Dan Gilbert in the early 90s, which suggests that people must intuitively find information to be true when they are presented with it. I'm going to run a 2,800 person experiment where I vary the quality of the information environment and show that people's judgments adapt to the quality of that environment. Then I'm going to use computational cognitive models that are tracing out the process of deliberation over time to argue that intuitions themselves are what are allowing for this adaptation to the environment. Second, I'm going to revisit the illusory truth effect, which is the finding that repetition leads to increased belief in content, and provide a rational model of repetition effects, suggesting that in a lot of environments that we generally find ourselves in, the illusory truth effect actually makes a lot of sense. Then I'm going to run an almost 5,000 person online experiment where, again, I vary the credibility and show that people adaptively interpret repetition in that environment. And finally, I'll look at process indicators and suggest that, again, intuitions are what are allowing for this type of adaptation rather than some type of costly deliberative process. And I pick these two biases because they are generally cited as two of the 3 or 4 most important reasons that people hold false beliefs. Great, so let's start looking at the truth bias. It's often argued that misinformation exploits the truth bias, and this is coming out generally of Spinozan models of cognition. So when you are presented with information, you must first comprehend and accept it, and it is only through a process of effortful deliberation that you can either confirm or disconfirm it. This has also led to kind of spin-off models in the lie detection literature called truth default theory, which suggests that when people are presented with information, they assume that the sender of the information is honest, and then through picking up on contextual cues and integrating that with deliberative processes, you either accept or reject that information. And this obviously can be particularly harmful on places like social media, where we think that this overwhelming environment draws our attention away from accuracy and makes that deliberative process difficult. So intuitions in these environments are going to make us very likely to believe misinformation. And underlying each of these models is the assumption that intuitions immutably favor belief. And this is really, kind of taken off in the misinformation literature to explain why people believe in misinformation. So, susceptibility to partisan fake news is better explained by a lack of reasoning than by motivated reasoning. But I want to argue that this actually makes a lot of sense. And so you all just saw this, I don't really need to go into it, but almost all of the information that people consume in their daily lives, even online, is true. Or at least, not false. And frozen. Great. Okay. And so I argue that this actually means that intuitions themselves should favor beliefs if they encode some type of valuable information about the environment. And this kind of argument is coming out of ecological rationality, which is work by Gerd Gigerenzer and colleagues that suggests that people adaptively use environmental statistics to simplify the process of updating on information. And a particularly valuable environmental statistic in information environments is the veracity base rate, or the proportion of true and false content. And if you are thinking of this in kind of a Bayesian setting, which I'm going to make the argument that we should be, this should actually shape one's prior belief. And the prediction taken together is that if the truth bias is well calibrated to the outside world, and it is kind of this ecologically rational process or adaptively rational process, that it should recalibrate in low quality environments. And that's what I'm going to show by designing this kind of counterfactual world that we don't often see, where almost all information is false. And so I recruit 2,800 participants on Lucid, and for 80 headlines, they see 80 headlines in this environment, and for each headline, they see it, kind of in the style, and then they respond with whether or not they think the headline is accurate or inaccurate. And they're randomly assigned to one of two conditions for an exposure phase. In the high quality condition, they see 80% true information. In the low quality condition, they see 80% false information. And then without knowing, they transition to a 30-round evaluation phase where that content is 50-50. So we have a really nice comparison of the types of judgments that people are making over time on the veracity of content. And importantly, at no point in this process do they receive any feedback on how they're doing or what is true or what is false. So any differences are going to be coming from their own perceptions of their judgments. And so the hypothesis is that the veracity base rate is going to form a flexible intuition that can be used in truth judgments. And so one of my co-authors loves these kind of fun designs. If you see primarily true content, when you then see false content, you're going to be more likely to misidentify it as truth. That's the kind of truth bias view of the world. But conversely, if you see primarily false content, when you then encounter true content, you are going to be more likely to misbelieve it as false. And this is going to let us kind of differentiate that prediction from other predictions coming from the literature. So in the Spinozan model, you expect that errors are systematically and consistently higher on false headlines in both conditions, or intuitions, they just can't move, and we're always going to be more likely to believe misinformation. And truth default theory suggests that a high proportion of false headlines is going to trigger this kind of contextual evaluation where you generate skepticism and you say, okay, I should really deliberate hard in this environment because there's a lot of liars. And this suggests that the discernment overall should be better in the low quality condition, but there should be kind of no asymmetry in the types of errors that people are making. So people, when encountering low quality information, should just do a better job at this task. And so let's see what we find. Here on the y-axis, I'm going to show you the error rate on these different headlines in that 30-round evaluation phase. For false headlines on the left, true headlines on the right, split by condition. And so for false headlines in the high quality good feed condition, there are higher errors. And then conversely, for true headlines, there are more errors in that low quality condition. So we see this nice kind of flip in the pattern of errors, suggesting that the judgments that people are making are adapting to the quality of the environment and then spilling over into this evaluation phase. And, as I make this kind of adaptive argument, here I'm going to show you how these error rates change over time. So I'm going to show you the 80 rounds of the experiment on the x-axis for false headlines on top, true headlines on the bottom, and the y-axis is again going to be the error rate. For false items, you see this nice divergence over time where errors in the high quality condition become more likely over time, but they actually decrease slightly in the low quality condition. A similar kind of pattern happens for true headlines where errors on true headlines become increasingly likely in the low quality condition, but decrease in the high quality condition. And so the overall error rate actually decreases throughout the course of the experiment, despite people devoting way less cognitive resources. So judgments become much quicker, they become better at this task. And partly that is coming from this type of adaptation to the environment, simplifying the types of judgments that need to be made. So I've argued so far that these adaptations are driven by intuitions. And so I want to kind of think about what it might mean for intuitions to impact beliefs in this type of setting. So let's say I go to a an environment where I have a lot of familiarity. So I have a long history of being exposed to the New York Times, and I should require kind of very little additional evidence when I see a headline to think that it is true because I have this long history with them. And so I should have updated this, but at this time at the end of March, the stock market was tanking, and this looks pretty true to me. I don't need a ton of evidence to kind of make that judgment. But I don't know if there are any Aussies in the audience. I don't know anything about Crikey. So that means that I should have kind of very weak intuitions about the quality of the information here. And I should require more evidence than in the case of the New York Times to make some judgment about whether a specific headline is true. And so we are going to be able to capture this exact logic using something called drift diffusion models. And this is a model of stochastic evidence accumulation coming from computational cognitive science. And so what this looks like is I can start this decision-making process with an initial intuition or bias about the correct action or correct judgment. And this is just that initial amount of evidence that I have. And then I can deliberate or drift my way towards a conclusion or a boundary. And that's just the total amount of evidence that I need to make a decision in one direction or the other. And we're going to make the assumption that evidence is going to accumulate on average in the direction of plausibility. So if a headline is plausible, I'm going to drift towards it being true. And if it is implausible, I'm going to drift towards it being false. And we're going to get these plausibility ratings from pretests. And what we're most interested in here is how this bias term might incorporate prior information. And kind of in the supplements of the paper, we show that incorporating the veracity base rate through the bias term both reduces the cognitive costs associated with making these judgments and reduces the overall errors. So this prior information is actually quite valuable. And we expect that when you are exposed to primarily true information, you demonstrate a truth bias. You have evidence favoring that information might be true. And if you see false information, the opposite happens, where you have initial evidence favoring that information is likely to be false. And the prediction that also allows us to fit the model is that faster and more frequent decisions in the direction of the base rate are going to occur coming out of that kind of process of needing less information given a strong intuition. And so let's see what happens. Great. Here I'm going to show you the 4 parameters of the drift diffusion models. These are going to be the Bayesian posterior distribution for the bounds, the non-decision time, and the drift rate. All of these are statistically indistinguishable from each other. But let's see what happens with the bias term, which is encoding, again, those intuitions. On the y-axis, it's going to be plotted in log odds space. So a more positive value shows that you have kind of more trusting intuitions or that truth bias, and a more negative value shows that you have this false bias where you are maybe skeptical. It's going to be split by bad feed on the left and good feed on the right. And these two things are very, very different. So in the bad feed condition, people demonstrate on average a very strong false bias, and in the high quality condition, they show a very strong truth bias. And here I'm going to show you again over the 80 rounds of the experiment how these intuitions dynamically adapt to the environment to encode important prior information. So in the high quality environment, as you're exposed to true information, this bias term encodes more information suggesting that news headlines are likely to be true. And then when you transition at round 50 to this unbiased environment, the bias term kind of tails back towards a more unbiased setting. In the low quality condition, you see a very similar pattern emerge, but there's kind of less tailback after round 50. And maybe this suggests that people, when they are exposed to misinformation, they remain skeptical for longer than if you're exposed to true information. And so very quickly, kind of what can we take away from this? First, intuitions are shaped by the structure of the information environment, and we show that this happens even with incentives. So we run a second version of this with 600 people, where one kind of randomly chosen judgment that people are making is incentivized with $6. It also suggests that bait and switch tactics may be particularly useful if you're trying to push specific pieces of misinformation, and there's kind of nice game theoretic evidence for this, but we're kind of working on the consumer side of this. So if you want people to believe some specific piece of misinformation, you should send a lot of true information or kind of cat and dog content. Or you should infiltrate existing high quality information environments, and people are going to have this, pretty gullible intuition, and they're going to be likely to fall for those pieces of information. And I think that there's some evidence on the more computational social science end that this kind of thing happened with Russian disinformation. It also suggests that interventions may induce excessive skepticism. So a lot of kind of misinformation interventions that we think about are like, oh, there's a lot of misinformation, think really hard, or like, be aware of misinformation, it's like totally rampant. And this suggests that there's actually kind of a harm to doing that, which is that people are going to be very likely to disbelieve true information, or at least have to exert a lot of cognitive effort to realize that something is true in these environments. And so deliberation is actually costly. And so what about more complex biases? This is just kind of some initial intuition that you have about the environment. We look at the illusory truth effect, which has been studied for 50 years in cognitive psychology, and it suggests that repeated exposure to a claim increases belief in that claim. And it's been studied for fake news, health claims, product claims, trivia statements, rumors, so on and so on, and has really kind of captured people's imagination about why misinformation is harmful and perhaps prevalent. So want to make a lie seem true, say it again and again and again. And the way that we generally think about the illusory truth effect working is that repetition is going to tap into kind of biased intuitions people have. So when I am presented with some piece of information, the first thing that I process before anything else is this fluid? Is it easily interpretable to me, which is something that comes out of it being repeated? And if not, then I engage in some type of good process of deliberation, where I retrieve relevant knowledge. And if I have relevant knowledge, I respond accurately, and if not, I make my best guess. But what happens if information is processed fluid? Then some of these models suggest that you are going to immutably respond that this information is likely to be true. I'm going to call this class of model a cognitive bias model. We also test against other types of models coming out of this in the paper. Largely, those models suggest that you can pick up on some ecological correlation between repetition and veracity. And when you get this fluent signal, you go, something's weird. I'm going to think really hard and reinterpret repetition in this environment. And so in the paper, we propose a kind of rational model of how to interpret repetition. I'm going to walk through the logic here, but not in a ton of detail. So this is building off work in rational speech acts, which suggests that the mapping between communication and meaning is probabilistic. So when you say something, I don't observe what you actually meant to say or what you actually meant to communicate. And so I have to make inferences about the underlying. And repetition, importantly, can clarify somebody's meaning in their statement. And the way that we capture this in the model is you are either a truth teller or you're a liar. And so repetition cues me to which of these is kind of likelier to be true. And one way that you can think about why repetition might matter is imagine that a child wants to touch a stove and the mom says, no, don't touch that stove, it's hot. And then again, it's hot, it's hot, it's hot, don't touch it. And that simple act of repetition conveys on the part of the sender or the mom that the stove really is hot and that this is important and should be considered. And so repetition provides kind of meaningful value when the child might infer, like my mom, she's overly cautious, I can touch this hot stove. And so what we argue is that when a sender is credible, as we've seen, throughout the course of these talks, in real life, repetition is likely to signal veracity. So sources are generally credible, but sometimes they make errors. But that probability of error decreases with additional repetitions if you think that there is some amount of additional judgment on the part of the sender in making that new communication. And in the paper, we show that this unifies kind of 4 key findings in literature under a common computational framework. And importantly, a way to test this model is by seeing what happens with a non-credible source. So we show that it captures a lot of the illusory truth literature when a source is credible, but let's see what happens when it's not. So we recruit 5,000 participants on Lucid, and then in an exposure phase, participants rate how likely they would be to like, share, or comment on 12 headlines, and they're randomized to one of 2 conditions. In the high quality condition, 75% of this information is true, and in the bad feed condition, 75% of this information is false. And then in an evaluation phase, they rate their belief in 18 headlines. And importantly, 3 true and 3 false headlines are repeated in every phase throughout the course of this. So there are going to be 3 true, 3 false headlines that when people are making that final evaluation of it, they have seen it 4 times. Everything else is only seen once. So there's something like 72 judgments that's happening over the course of this. 6 headlines repeated, everything else only seen once. And the prediction is going to be that the illusory truth effect is weaker in the low quality conditions. So when the sender is not credible, we predict that repetition might actually signal falsity, or at least that something is kind of less true than if the sender is credible. And so how do we get there? In the course of the familiarization phase, in the high quality condition, you see primarily true information, some false information, and some things that are repeated. And in the low quality condition, you see primarily false information. And this suggests that you should have kind of a different prior on the credibility of the source, or the likelihood that that source is to tell you true or false information. So in the high quality environment, we expect that source to be perceived as credible, and then the low quality environment to be perceived as less credible. And this allows us to kind of differentiate the cognitive bias model from the adaptively rational model that we've laid out. In the cognitive bias model, the source prior kind of doesn't affect the interpretation of repetition because fluency is retrieved before anything else in this setting. And so across these 2 conditions, you expect an equally strong illusory truth effect throughout both of them. Whereas for the adaptively rational model, when you perceive that source as high quality, you expect there to be the standard illusory truth effect. And then when you perceive the source as low quality, we expect there to be a substantial moderation of the effect, or potentially a reversal of the sign of the repetition effect. And so what do we see? Nothing. Okay. Great. So here I'm going to show you belief on a 0 to 100 scale for false headlines on the left, true headlines on the right, split by the high quality condition on the left and the low quality condition on the right in each of these. And then repetition is colored. So I'm going to walk through this very slowly because there's a lot happening. So first off, we see that there is an effect of the base rate. So in the high quality condition, information is believed about 6 to 7 percentage points more on average. That suggests that we have successfully manipulated perceptions of source credibility here. And it also kind of confirms our results from the previous study where the quality of information environment impacts the priors that people have. Then we see in the high quality condition is a kind of standard illusory truth. So this is about 4 percentage points or 4.5 percentage points for false headlines. And this is much, much smaller for repeated headlines in the low quality condition. It's about 25% the size for false headlines. And then a similar pattern emerges for true headlines where you have a standard illusory truth effect. It is smaller for true headlines in general, and actually doesn't appear in the low quality condition for true headlines. So it appears that there's kind of a moderated interpretation of repetition in the low quality environment relative to the high quality environment. We've done, all the checks for, nonlinearities and stuff, and it holds. And while we can learn a lot from the average treatment effects, I think that it's pretty informative what actual participants are doing throughout the course of the environment. Or the course of the experiment. Here on the x-axis, I'm going to show you the individual level effect of repetition. And these are going to be probability density functions. So for the high quality condition, the median participant showed about a 2.2 percentage point increase in belief in repeated headlines. And it's negative and insignificant in the low quality environment. So most people in the low quality environment show no evidence of the standard illusory truth effect. We use kind of finite mixture models to decompose these distributions into different strategies that people are using. And what we find is that an alternative strategy associating repetition with falsity seems to emerge in the low quality condition and is disproportionately used by those people. But there are a mass of people who don't kind of pick up on, we think, the credibility of the source and make this adjustment. And so very quickly, how do adaptations occur? we are going to split participants by their score on the cognitive reflection test, which is a measure of how intuitive or deliberative people are, and show the effect of deliberation for those people in the high quality and the low quality environment. And so in the high quality environment, deliberative participants show a small but significant illusory truth effect of about 1.5 percentage points, whereas intuitive participants show a much, much stronger illusory truth effect. So it is about 2 percentage points larger for low CRT or intuitive participants. This is the first kind of evidence in the literature that CRT can moderate the effect of illusory truth. One interpretation is the environmental quality matters, which I think is true, but also power. We have about 10 times more people in this study than other studies that are looking at the effect of cognitive reflection on the illusory truth effect. And then we want to see how repetition is interpreted by deliberative and intuitive people in the low quality environment relative to the high quality environment. So there's functionally no difference for deliberative participants. So these are people who we think generally have good kind of cognitive processes for identifying misinformation, and they don't adjust the quality of the source at all. But intuitive participants show a huge moderation of the effect. So in the low quality environment, there are people who seem to pick up on repetition signaling falsity, and they adapt. And so what we think is happening is that people who rely more on intuitions or heuristics get more feedback on their validity in an environment and adjust them over the course of time. We also have other evidence that this adaptation is occurring intuitively, looking at response times. Response times are much quicker for repeated items in both conditions, but equally so. And so we think that these judgments are intuitive and equally so in both conditions. Very quickly, I want to talk about one kind of additional experiment that we ran where we try to see if this holds with naturalistic source credibility. In the experiment, we're varying the quality of information and people have to learn a lot and pick up on it. So we want something where people really know the credibility of the source. So we turn to US politics and recruit 2,500 participants on Lucid, and we expose them to statements from either Trump or Biden. And we make sure to recruit partisans so they have very strong views of Trump or Biden. And what we find is that there is no illusory truth effect for one's distrusted politician. So Democrats, in particular, when they view statements from Trump, there is no illusory truth effect. And for statements that are initially most polarizing, so where there is the most disagreement between Democrats and Republicans on their veracity, repetition actually leads to polarization on these headlines. So as you repeat them, Democrats decrease their belief and Republicans increase their belief. And so kind of summing up all of this work, cognition appears to be shaped by the structure of the environment. People form representations of what's happening, and the cognitive processes themselves adapt to help navigate these complex structures. It also, this type of cognitive adaptation, we show in the truth bias paper, actually explains cross-cultural variation in the truth bias. So we look at the effect of intuition on belief across 16 different countries. And we find that in countries with low quality media environments, intuitions don't actually point towards belief in those environments. And so this finding that intuitions lead people to believe misinformation seems to be a finding that is generally restricted to kind of weird countries or like Western educated democratic countries. It also suggests that beliefs about the context and the source can adaptively shape responses to content. And if you want to understand the judgments and the decisions that people are making, you need to first start with an understanding of the context and the representations that people form of those contexts. And this can explain kind of how polarization can occur, not through people being tricked, but through largely rational processes. And I've shown that this helps to explain variation in both the truth bias and in the illusory truth bias. And yeah, thank you for having me. I had really great collaborators on these projects, Cameron Martell, Dave Rand, Rahul Bowie, and the working papers are posted up there as well as my website. So thank you. Yeah.
Very nice talk. Thank you. Super interesting effects. Can you explain again how exactly the repeated exposure was operationalized? Did you was it within a couple of minutes? Were there any stimuli in between? And is that the standard paradigm that's being used in all these type of studies?
Right. So it's, how do I pull up hidden slides. Anyone know?
I guess
Okay, so this is the actual experimental design, where in the familiarization phase, we expose people to either a high quality or low quality condition, and in a random order, they give us liking, sharing, or commenting intentions. And again, it has that breakdown that I talked about. And then we have no break in between the familiarization phase and the evaluation phase, which is somewhat standard. Often people have like a little kind of break, like you fill out demographics or you do the CRT, but we wanted to make sure that people knew that this was kind of coming from the same source of information. So we don't do that here, and they immediately transition to the evaluation phase. They do know that these phases are different because we were asking people different questions there. And so there's this whole question of like source memory and how people encode this that we're kind of getting around here. We just want to look at like what information does repetition convey when you perfectly know who the source of that information is. And then we can build on this to try to understand how this interacts with memory.
And a follow-up question on that, then, did you in any of these studies look at a later time point as a follow-up measure? Because
no, we didn't.
I think a big element of illusory truth might also be memory, right? So maybe people would remember it on a later point more than the other ones.
Right. So we did not do that. I want to. I think that there is a possibility that people encode this as coming from a past environment and remember it later. I think that's actually somewhat unlikely. But I think that kind of our model of the illusory truth effect would suggest that if you have uncertainty about the source, given the quality of the information environment, it's actually a relatively good inference that the source is high quality. And so, I would kind of argue that if a more standard illusory truth process appears if you don't know who the source is, that is still coming out of kind of rational processes. Yeah.
Was expecting that you might show reaction time data for your first study.
Sure.
Guess you would suggest that in the good feed condition, people take longer to make decisions of false when making false decisions. Do you find that?
I guess I took it out, but yes, that's what we find. Okay. So response times are quicker. Maybe I actually do have it, whatever. Response times are actually quicker in the direction of the base rate in both conditions. And so that is kind of evidence that you have these initial intuitions and then you don't need that much additional evidence. And so that's really kind of the underlying assumption of the drift diffusion model. Yeah.
Thank you for this fascinating research. I was intrigued by your comment after the first paper around interventions. So you said interventions are likely to create more skepticism.
Yep.
What would you recommend considering?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think Dave here would want me to plug accuracy prompts. There is work by House Lin that is also using drift diffusion models and showing that these accuracy prompts change what people are thinking about when deciding whether or not to share information. It doesn't change kind of the process, the amount of evidence that people need or generate that type of skepticism. I think that I like these kind of this work coming out of Gigerenzer's lab and people kind of in that space on like fast and frugal trees and kind of developing these like boosting mechanisms for trying to help people make these like very quick decisions without devoting a ton of cognitive effort. I think on the side of platforms, assuming that people do develop these like intuitions that are useful, you want to kind of preserve continuity across different sections of the environment. And if you think that somebody's entering into kind of a lower quality part of the environment, maybe you want to cue them so they don't misapply these intuitions that have been developed elsewhere. Yeah, and this is certainly not to say that like we should never have people think hard or deliberate. I just think that like it is important to keep in mind that there are costs to generating skepticism and costs to forcing deliberation. Yeah,
I'm kind of thinking just because there's like obviously a lot of discussion about like echo chambers and like sort of there's like belief chambers. Like if I am fully subscribed to this information and believe with the people, all of that, and I'm going, for example, for my Facebook, I would perceive all of that as truth. So that I would be overall like sort of essentially would like the low quality and high quality would essentially switch based on my beliefs.
Yep, that's exactly right. So all of this is working through kind of subjective perceptions of plausibility. So you don't actually have access to what is true and what is false. You just have information about your own beliefs about what is true and what is false. And so if you think that all the low quality information is true, you're going to think you're in that high quality information environment. Intuitions are going to point towards truth. Here, people have enough of an access to ground truth that our manipulations work. But it's a noisy instrument for what we actually care about, which is subjective plausibility.
Have you screened the annotators about, for example, about the prior beliefs, or like if they are sort of more into, let's say, outside of just like this information language process?
What do you mean by that?
Like if you had like substantial portion, let's say like I don't know 10-15% of like anti-vaxxers or something like that in the annotator set, then obviously it would sort of largely affect the sort of results.
Yeah, right. So we do see, we don't really have a way to like identify anti-vaxxers. We could do that, but we do see that the manipulation in the first study is weaker by a little bit for Republicans. And that kind of fits with general findings in the misinformation space that like Republicans are worse at identifying misinformation. I think, part of that might just be like headline set composition and kind of what we include in our headlines as true and false. But that holds here. And if you are worse at identifying the ground truth of information, the intervention is going to have less of an effect on you. Yeah.
Thank you. Great talk. In the first study, you prompt every participant to always deliberate about every headline.
On every headline, we ask them whether they think it's accurate or inaccurate. Yes.
Do you think the updates to the bias or intuition are bigger? Because on social media, you don't deliberate about most things. I just scroll and see 10 headlines and maybe.
So I think that the process would be much slower on social media. I think for many reasons. One, we have like much more kind of experience on social media. So we have set priors already. Even if you are entering a new social media environment, you have other information environments that you have participated in throughout the course of your life. You can make inferences. You also are probably not deliberating on everything. This type of deliberation, where this judgment that we are forcing is probably going to make you pick up more on the base rate than you would otherwise. But on the other hand, you do get kind of much more direct feedback on social media about like what might be true and what may be false. And so I think that here we have kind of outlined like the way that we model this when we do simulations of it is people are updating their prior beliefs via some like beta binomial, where essentially you're just counting the number of true and false headlines subject to like, how quickly you want to do that updating process. And I think probably what happens more on social media is there are like particular examples that really stand out to you and force you to kind of update.
There may be a question in the
on the effect sizes in the first study. Yes. So I'll respond in two ways. One, in terms of effect sizes, I think that these are actually like relatively large effect sizes. So the effect of the base rate is about twice the size of the effect of a headline being politically concordant on judgment. So it seems that this actually matters quite a bit relative to something that we're all very concerned about, which is like politically motivated reasoning, or kind of politically driven perceptions. People, it's hard to answer the question of whether or not people are adapting sufficiently. So you could imagine writing down some type of Bayesian model about how people should be updating. If you do a very simple version of this, people are not updating nearly enough. You know, if you interpret kind of their bias term, if you transform it from log odd space, they are in the high quality condition demonstrating maybe 60% of headlines are likely to be true, and the low quality condition is 40%. And we know it's 80 and 20. But one thing that you have to account for is your own beliefs about how good you are at identifying true and false information. And so there is uncertainty in your own judgments. In that process of modeling it, it's very hard to get at like what the correct perception would be. So it's very hard to come up with a normative benchmark. Yeah.
I was thinking about how people are moving towards consuming information in short form video.
Yeah.
And there's obviously a very different kind of setup with the headlines. Have you thought about what it would be, what it look like practically to try and do? I mean, I imagine it might be difficult to try and do this in that sort of a format or with that kind of ecological.
Yeah, that would be cool. Some of my like colleagues are starting to work on short form videos, and so that'd be a lot of fun. I'm like to do that with videos, really any content you want. I'm nominally in a marketing department, so I should do it with ads at some point. But yeah.
Thank you.